In 1949, 74 boys thought they were joining a science club to get extra food and Mickey Mouse watches. They didn't know they were eating radioactive oatmeal for a corporate marketing study. In 2025, the evidence of this crime went up in flames. This is the story of how America erased its most inconvenient children. On April 2025, a massive 4-alarm fire ripped through an abandoned campus in Waltham, Massachusetts. As the flames consumed the rotting wood and brick of the Fernald State School, most people saw a tragic accident or a piece of urban decay finally meeting its end. But for those who know the history of this soil, the fire wasn't an accident. It was a finishing move. For over a century, the Fernald State School wasn't just an institution. It was a warehouse for the inconvenient. A place where the state of Massachusetts practiced a form of social engineering so cold and so calculated that it makes the darkest dystopian fiction look like a bedtime story. Imagine waking up as a 7-year-old boy. Your mother is gone. Your foster home is full. The state needs a place to put you. They don't find you a family. They find you a cage. And before you even unpack your single bag, a bureaucrat stamps a word on your permanent record that will follow you to the grave. Moron. This wasn't a playground insult. In the early 20th century, moron was a clinical classification, a medical death sentence. It meant you were genetically inferior. It meant you were a threat to the purity of the American gene pool. And once that stamp hit your file, you ceased to be a citizen. You became property. But the label was just the beginning. The real horror started with a bowl of oatmeal. In the late 1940s, while the rest of the world was recovering from the brutality of World War II, a group of elite scientists from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology arrived at Fernald. They didn't come to teach. They didn't come to heal. They came to use. They created a science club for the boys living in the brutal conditions of Fernald, where sitting with your arms unfolded could get you beaten. The science club sounded like a miracle. It promised extra food. It promised trips to Red Sox games. It promised Mickey Mouse watches. It promised the one thing these abandoned children craved more than food: attention. Fred Boyce was one of those boys. He joined the club because he thought someone finally cared. He thought the men in white coats were his friends. He didn't know that every morning he sat down for breakfast, he was participating in a high-stakes corporate marketing war funded by Quaker Oats. He didn't know the oatmeal he was eating was laced with radioactive iron and calcium. And he certainly didn't know that the United States Atomic Energy Commission was watching his spleen absorb that radiation from the shadows. Between 1946 and 1953, at least 74 boys were turned into living Geiger counters. They were fed radiation for breakfast, so a cereal company could prove their product was better than a competitor. The crime wasn't just the radiation. It was the architecture of silence that allowed it to happen. The parents who were still in the picture were sent letters about nutritional improvements. The word radiation was never used. For the children who were wards of the state, the man who approved the experiments was the same man who ran the school. There was no oversight. There was no one to say no. And as we sit here in 2026, watching the physical evidence of Fernald burn to the ground, we have to ask ourselves, how many other science clubs are still hidden in the archives? How many other children were erased so that a corporation could gain a 1% edge in the market? The science club at Fernald was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a much larger, darker infection that had spread through the highest levels of the American scientific and governmental establishment. While Fred Boyce was being fed radioactive oatmeal, he was just one of thousands. By December 1993, when Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary finally opened the heavy iron doors of the archives, the world caught a glimpse of the true scale. President Bill Clinton's Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, established in early 1994, began to peel back the layers of a 30-year shadow war conducted on its own citizens. Between 1944 and 1974, the United States government sponsored several thousand human radiation experiments. The estimated number of victims? At least 20,000. And the pattern was always the same. They chose the people who had no one to listen to their screams. They chose the institutionalized, the imprisoned, the terminally ill, the poor, and the abandoned. They chose the people society had already decided did not count. At Vanderbilt University in the 1940s, 800 pregnant women were given vitamin drinks that contained radioactive iron. They were never told. They were simply data points in a study on maternal nutrition. At the University of Iowa in 1953, newborn babies were fed radioactive iodine. They were days old. They had no names yet, but they already had a classification in a government ledger. In Cincinnati, between 1960 and 1971, over 200 cancer patients, most of them poor, most of them black, were irradiated without informed consent. They were told they were receiving treatment for their disease. In reality, the Pentagon was using them to study how much radiation a soldier could withstand on a nuclear battlefield before becoming incapacitated. They weren't being cured. They were being measured for their breaking point. Prisoners in Washington and Oregon were used for radiation tests on their reproductive organs. Over 200,000 military personnel were exposed during atomic weapons tests, often told to march toward the mushroom clouds to see what would happen to their bodies. And then there were the 18 people who were injected with plutonium at hospitals across the country. They were sick, they were vulnerable, and they were turned into living waste sites for the most toxic substance on Earth. None of them were told what was being put into their veins. The justification was always the same: for the greater good, for national security, for science. But a 1947 Internal Atomic Energy Commission memorandum revealed the true motivation behind the secrecy. The document stated, in cold, typed letters, that these experiments should not be made public because it might have an adverse effect on public opinion or result in legal suits. They didn't hide it because it was a mistake. They hid it because they knew it was a crime. They knew that if the American people saw what was happening to the morons in Waltham or the pregnant women in Nashville, the machine would have to stop. So they waited. They waited for the survivors to grow old. They waited for the records to be lost. And they waited for the perfect moment to tell the truth. That moment came on October 3, 1995. On that day, the Advisory Committee released its final report. President Clinton stood at a White House ceremony and issued a formal apology. It was a moment that should have stopped the nation. It was a revelation of state-sponsored betrayal on a continental scale. But almost no one remembers that apology. Why? Because October 3, 1995, was the exact same day the entire world was staring at a television screen, waiting for two words: not guilty. The O.J. Simpson verdict, the most consumed media event of the decade, swallowed the history of 20,000 victims whole. Whether that timing was a freak accident of the calendar or a masterstroke of information management, the result was the same. The truth was released into a vacuum of silence. the victims were erased for a second time. When the news of the radiation experiments finally broke in the mid-90s, the survivors didn't ask for millions of dollars. They didn't ask for fame. Fred Boyce, who spent 11 years inside the iron gates of Fernald, asked for something much simpler, yet infinitely harder for the state to give. He wanted the word moron removed from his record. He wanted the state of Massachusetts to admit that he was never feeble-minded. He wanted them to admit that he was just a boy who had been abandoned by his mother, neglected by the foster system, and then systematically uneducated by an institution that used his labor to keep its own laundry running and its floors swept. Fred Boyce taught himself to read as an adult. He married. He raised a family. He built a life out of the scraps of a society that told him he was subhuman. But until the day he died on May 6, 2006, that clinical stamp remained. The state refused to change it. To change the record would be to admit the entire eugenics-based architecture of the 20th century was a lie. And so the labels stayed. The victims grew old, and the physical world began to follow them into oblivion. The Fernald State School officially closed its doors in November 2014. For a decade, the 72 buildings sat rotting on 200 acres of prime real estate. It became a ghost map of a forgotten atrocity. But in early 2024, something strange happened. A journalist named Oliver Egger, who, in a twist of historical irony, is the great-great-grandson of the school's namesake, Walter Fernald, walked onto the abandoned campus. What he found wasn't just dust and broken glass. He found thousands of confidential patient records, medical files, personal histories. The most intimate details of lives spent in cages were simply left on the floor. The state had abandoned the very records they were legally required to protect. It was a final act of negligence, a literal throwing away of the human beings who had already been discarded once before. Then came April 2025. A 4-alarm fire swept through the site. The buildings where the science club met, where the radioactive oatmeal was served, where the boys sat with their arms folded in silence. They all began to turn to ash. Is it a coincidence that the physical evidence of America's most shameful scientific chapter is disappearing just as the last survivors are passing away? Is it a coincidence that the records were left accidentally exposed to the elements and the flames? When the fire dies down and the bulldozers move in to build luxury condos or tech parks, there will be nothing left to show that 74 boys were once used as corporate lab rats. There will be no monument to the 20,000 citizens who were irradiated in the name of a Cold War that didn't care about their lives. We live in a world built on the data points of these victims. Every time a doctor tells you that milk builds strong bones, you are hearing a fact purchased with the bone marrow of 9 boys who were injected with radioactive calcium without their knowledge. Every time you read a nutritional label on a box of cereal, you are looking at a science that was refined in the spleens of abandoned children. The science is still on our shelves, but the names of the people who paid for it are being scrubbed from the earth. Fred Boyce once said that learning the truth about the science club was a disappointing type of feeling. He didn't scream. He didn't rage. He was just disappointed. Because he realized that even when the state said they cared, even when they gave him a Mickey Mouse watch and a trip to a baseball game, they were just measuring how long it took for the poison to reach his blood. The Fernald campus is burning. The records are rotting. The buildings are coming down. But history isn't just what is written in a file. It is what we choose to remember when the world tells us to look at the O.J. Simpson verdict instead. It is the refusal to let the fire have the last word. Next time you pour a bowl of cereal, look at the milk, look at the oats, and ask yourself, what else is being hidden in the fire today?
Who are the morons of 2026? And who is holding the spoon?